And we're on. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I'm so glad to welcome you this morning and to welcome my dear friends, Rabbi Marc Gellman of Florida and Gulf Digest, and Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University. And we are delighted to have you with us this morning, to celebrate our Shabbos. Here in Southern California, it is 86 degrees. I'm not kidding you. So if you are freezing cold somewhere in the East or the Midwest, I want to tell you that just get close to the television, to the computer, and you will warm up because it is a beautiful, warm day. I don't know what it's like in Florida, Marc, but it's really nice here.
It's
So
beautiful
thank you
here.
for coming on this morning. This morning we're going to be looking at Parshat Bo. It's the third of the four parshiot in the beginning of the book of Exodus, the beginning of the book of Shemot, which tell the Passover story. So there should be crumbs in your biblical text as you're reading it through. This is the sort of denouement, because next week, I'll give you a preview. Next week, we're leaving Egypt and crossing the Red Sea and singing the song. But this week, this is the sort of climactic chapter of the story of the plagues. The story begins with the three last plagues: the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness, and the plague of the killing of the firstborn. And what is remarkable about these plagues is, whereas the other plagues affected aspects of Egyptian society, the plague of blood is on the river, and the frogs crawled around these three plagues affect everybody. Nobody can escape. The locusts eat all the food. The darkness covers everything, and there's no escaping it. It's darkness inside and out. And of course, the most frightening one of all, the death of the firstborn, is again ubiquitous and universal. And in the middle of the story, tucked in the middle of the story, as it were, stops. It's a very strange Parsha literarily, because the story stops and Moses says to the people, I want you to know how you're going to tell this story to your children when the time comes that we will be leaving Egypt. And this is the Parsha that includes the beginning of the Jewish calendar. This is the beginning of the counting of the months. This will be the event that will launch Jewish history, as it were. This is the event that will launch Jewish time. So the Parsha is very sort of self-conscious about the idea that this is not only the end of the story of our Exodus and the end of our story of our liberation from slavery, it's also the beginning of a new chapter. It's a beginning of a chapter of memory, beginning of somebody's ringing, I think, beginning of a chapter of how we're going to remember this, because this is the event that's going to shape and change us as a people. So let's take a moment and think about these events. We have the remarkable confrontation of Moses and Pharaoh once again, and of a God who keeps whacking Egypt, and both to punish them for the slavery, and also to sort of create an image of who God is in the world. Marc, talk to me about who God is in the world, who brings these plagues, and what we're to think about God and what we learn about God from the plagues of Egypt.
Yeah, I think the plagues force God to appear in the world as a God who is different than what God really is. It forces God to appear as a stronger Pharaoh, as a mightier Pharaoh. And that's exactly what God is not. God is a God of truth and justice and compassion and kindness, but mainly virtue, where God's intention is to raise up people who will act on the basis of virtue, of what is right, not what they have to do or they're going to get killed by God. And what happens is that God knew this from the beginning. God knows everything from the beginning, but because of our free will, God is put into a very difficult position in the Torah. And God makes a decision prompted by Moses, who says to God when they had their first conversation, and God says, look, go to Egypt and just tell them to leave. Tell them to leave and come and worship me. Moses says to God, it's not going to work, God. They will only let you go, and Pharaoh will only let them go because of a yad chazakah, the strong hand, which we can translate loosely in this discussion as the power of force, of coercion. So God agrees with Moses and shows Moses a few initial little itty bitty signs. The hand turns leprous, the staff turns into a snake. And then they get involved in the whole drama of the plagues. And the plagues get the people out, but there is no act of faith involved in leaving Egypt. They're coerced into leaving Egypt in the same way that Pharaoh is coerced in letting them go. Nobody is free. Nobody is acting on a principle of virtue and love and faith. No one. And so the end result is, as soon as they get free and they go through the sea, as soon as there's a problem, oh, we should have never left Egypt. God isn't really as strong as we thought God was. God isn't as strong as Pharaoh. And then in the end, God is trapped. Now, God's intention in this was brilliant. It was to say to Moses, look, getting out of Egypt is really going to be the easy part. Getting Egypt out of the people is going to be the hard part. And the intention, the mechanism of getting Egypt out of the people was Sinai. Sinai, the revelation at Sinai, was the way that the people could learn to have faith in God and not just faith in power. And that's my sense of the tragedy of the Torah. And Moses then says to God, and wait a second, you have some other problems. If we're going to take over the land, you're still trapped in the problem of power and force, because the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all the ites, you're not going to displace the ites by telling them, you just go, shoo. They have to be forcefully evicted from the land. And in the end, the rest of the Torah is a manipulation of force and holding force. And then there's an empire, Saul, David, and Solomon. And in the end, the people are not worthy of following God as a matter of faith. And the only people who figured this out were the people who eventually reinvented Judaism, the rabbis. And they created a new religion which didn't require God to use force. And that is where we are today.
So if you were to,
between force and faith.
So turn this into a positive for a moment. I want to
Okay.
figure what the lesson for authority is. If you have a God who shows up and says, well, the visual is amazing. You've been looking up from your slave quarter, looking up at Pharaoh. And now you're going to look up at a mountain where God lives. You're always looking up for some kind of an authority to tell you what to do, an authority who demands obedience, an authority who does things for you, whose reward for obedience is all of the prizes. And you're saying that that's not what ultimately God wanted. He wanted something else.
That isn't what God wants.
Religion wants a different kind of loyalty than the prizes you get from obedience. So what is the other way?
The other way is the heart. God wants the heart.
So talk to me about that.
After the highest point of faith in the Torah is right after the people go through the sea, and it says, "Vayaminu b'Adonai." They all agreed. They all had faith in God. Just for that moment, for that little moment, after that great miracle and all the plagues, they believed in God. But it's a very, very tenuous thing. Faith is a difficult thing, but it is the only way to get to God. The only way. Force does not work.
See, I don't think. Go ahead. I don't think it's force. I think it's magic. It's.
Okay, that's a form of force. I agree.
I give you what you want, and therefore your loyalty to me. But then if the reason you're loyal is because of the things I gave you what you wanted. The moment that I can't give you what you want, you depart. It's a conditional love.
Yes.
And the question is, how do you move from a conditional love, I give you what you want and you love me, to an unconditional love?
The highest point.
I love you anyway.
The
I love you
highest
because I
point that
love you.
the highest point the rabbis get to is Ben Azai in Pirkei Avot, when he says, "Schar mitzvah mitzvah." The
Right,
reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. Ben Azai presaging Kant, who had the same idea.
right.
I don't know if he read Ben Azai. My guess is he didn't. He was a Lutheran. The fact of the matter is, the only reward for doing a good deed is the good deed itself. It isn't all the other stuff which you rightly call magic and that kind of payoff. It's not a, God is not a bubblegum machine. And so the only way to reach the highest levels of faith is to go beyond force, beyond magic, and to get to the place where the reward of goodness is goodness itself.
I want to add, Marc, that that's an aspirational model because the rabbi set it up by commanding us to do the mitzvot. They recognize that transactional is our default and that the goal of schar mitzvah mitzvah is actually something that we aspire to. And I like how you said it's the highest one, right? The reality is our default is to be transactional. Our goal in life is to eliminate the transactional nature of our being and aspire to be someone who does it for the heart and believes in it in our relationships, in our halakha, in our observance of Judaism, fill in the blank.
I completely agree, Sherre. That's a very good point. It's an excellent point. And it helps us, it opens the door to understanding this massive point, this huge point, this liberating point, which is that there is no such thing as one level of faith, that the Torah is intending to teach faith on different levels. If all you can care about is that God might punish you, okay, if that keeps you from acting like a zhlub, then believe God's going to punish you. But if you can get to Ben Azai's level, then you're at a higher level of faith.
Sorry, I'm so invested because it's so interesting. But I would say that it's not about stages like a ladder. I think it's actually a mosaic within each of us. Sometimes I'm Ben Azai, sometimes in relationships I'm very base, and that there's a constellation in me, and that the Torah is trying to recognize all those different aspects of us. And the idea is by the end, whatever the end is, you're a higher percentage of a Ben Azai, but it's not a rung, because the possibility of not being transactional every day is something that's too aspirational. That, i.e., is being God.
Right. You can't be I thou all the time. You jump to I it. Lawrence Kohlberg was the famous psychologist at Harvard who came up with this sort of hierarchy of moral thinking.
Yes.
Right. And somebody did an analysis of the Torah in the same way. So there's moments of the Torah when you're on the lowest moral thinking, obey me and I will reward you, or whatever, might makes right. And then you get to a higher one, which is a social contract, which is we all do this together because this is what we do. And then you get to the highest ones, which are principled, right? But I think Sherry's point is that all of us live on all of these levels all the time, and we vary from one to the other. The question is, can you slowly move yourself up toward principled, unconditional loyalty to things that really matter to you, rather than waiting for these rewards or for magic tricks or for signs and symbols to push you either through fear or through prizes. Go ahead, Sherre.
Okay, well, let me ask you, my dear friends, because it's very important to me on this issue of transactional faith. Are there moments when you ask God for stuff? And when those moments come, as Sherre says, they come for all of us, how do you feel about it? When I have those moments, I will start and say, I'm ashamed of myself. I am ashamed of myself because I know better. And I know that God isn't a bubblegum machine. But there are moments when I want bubblegum. And Sherry's right. There's these moments. But I think the key is when you have those moments, if you're capable of a high level of faith, you are also capable of rejecting those moments. When I studied Buddhism, that was my biggest takeaway from there, that they have really taken seriously this idea of reaching nibbana, a kind of enlightenment. And that enlightenment is the goal of all religions.
So I would say something different, Marc. we're not Buddhist. I'm not a Buddhist. And yet I've spent 12 days in silence at a Vipassana meditation retreat. So I have a little tiny inkling of experience. What I would say is, why does it have to be in that moment that you're ashamed? Why can't there be an embracing of that you're human, right? I think the shame and the rejection and the guilt adds to the transactional problem that we're dealing with. What if it's just part of me is transactional, part of me is not, and I'm aspiring to become less so? And there's moments that are so dire in my life that I go to the basest part of me, which is like, please God, whatever you do, no matter what, make this person live, right? Or please God, no matter what, give me a bike for Hanukkah, right? Whatever it is, not to make those equal. But my point being is like, why does it have to be a shaming, rejecting experience? Why can't there just be a part
Because
of our
God isn't like that. God isn't like, and the reason God isn't like that is that if the person is not healed of cancer, if you don't get what you want, if the person you love more than life dies, you are going to feel betrayed by God.
But I'm not talking about God in this moment. I'm talking about you. I'm saying in that moment, when you're in the depths of that suffering, that you go to that place, why does it then have to be a further whipping of I'm ashamed and guilt? Why can't it just be that I'm in that much suffering? I'm not talking about God. I'm not talking about our theology. I'm talking
Oh, I
about,
thought we were. I'm sorry.
I
thought
am, but
we
I'm
were.
talking about the direction of when you're in that moment of desperate pleading and bargaining with God.
Well, that is with God then.
Yeah.
It is with God, but it's a reflection on you. It's not a reflection on God.
Yeah, look,
So
Sherre, I think it's absolutely normal and fine. I don't think it's spiritually embarrassing to say, I hope my mother recovers from her heart condition, which she did not, and that Tommy recovered from his Parkinson's, which he did not. I needed that. I wanted that, but I didn't ask God for that. I didn't ask God to heal them. What I asked God for in all of those moments was, dear God, give me the strength to endure this and be with me. Be with me as I go through this.
So I would just say that it's not about the transaction. When I asked God, when my mother was dying, and I think this is a perfect example, I didn't say, I knew the science of a glioblastoma malforma. I knew that it would take her life in a very violent way. What I did ask for God was that she was at peace, that she was comfortable, that I could be with her and she could be connected to me. And I'm saying in those moments of bargaining, I wasn't bargaining for her to live, but in those moments of her bargaining for peace is just is also transactional, that I have the ability to accept that I want that and that I can talk to God and ask for that.
Yeah, see, I think that's right. And I agree with that. And the tradition also agrees with that. The prayer for a misa yafa, a good death, is a legitimate prayer. And what you're saying to God is, I don't want, if you look, if they get healed, if it's a nes, a miracle, fine. But I'm just saying that I hope they have a good death.
Mhm.
I hope they have a good death. And in counseling dying people, that has been very comforting.
And I'm just saying that still is an ask. And when you make those asks, there is a transactional nature to them. And when you do, it's okay. It's not a source of shame. It's not a source of self-flagellation.
But asking God to give someone a good death, I don't think is transactional, because you're not asking God to heal them. You're not asking for a change in the natural order of things. Olam kamin hago noheg.
Okay.
The world goes according to its own laws.
Okay. We can debate what is an ask and what is legitimate and what is judgment and whatever. But I'm saying whenever you're in that moment of asking, right, that I think there's a moment to acknowledge it's not a shame. You're not bad when you're asking. You're just not.
Depends what you're asking for.
I disagree.
Okay, all right. So that's fine. That's where we are. So let's stop there for a minute. Now, let's turn our attention. Marc has made a point about the plagues and about God's intention in the plagues and the consequences of what happens to faith that comes out of the narrative of the plagues. Let's turn for a moment back to Egypt for a moment. Let's go to Pharaoh. What's really abundantly clear in this Torah portion is the pathological stubbornness of Pharaoh. I mean, in last week's Torah portion, where the plagues are introduced, you get a Pharaoh. At first, he's hardening his heart. At first, he's toughing it out. But this week, it becomes pathological. His own generals come to him and say, "We're dead men. Look what you've done to us." His own people are begging for some relief. Moses keeps coming back to him, and he's just more and more stubborn, more and more set. The heart is hardened, so terribly hardened. The interesting thing is the Torah 5 times says that Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then 5 times God hardens his heart. And Rambam, Maimonides' comment is, once you've hardened your heart so far, God withdraws the possibility of reversal from you. You lose that element of free will. Sherre, let's talk about that for just a minute. Stubbornness, hard-heartedness, being stuck in a certain way of looking and responding to the world. It's an affliction that all of us suffer from at some point or another, and it's poisonous.
First, I just want to say, Eddie, you framed that so beautifully. Pathological stubbornness is an affliction that we are all dealing with. We are stuck in our rightness. And the fact that COVID has put us in our own little isolated echo chambers has emphasized it even deeper. We've become so affirmed in our rightness. And what throws me about this Parsha is these plagues are crazy, and Pharaoh digs down deeper. And that's what I think is the problem. The more that we're afflicted, the more we double down on our rightness. Except that's when we have to double down on taking the contrary action and being as curious and as open as possible. I always say to my husband, do you want to be right or do you want to be married? Right? Like, it's not about just politics, or it's about every relationship we're in. Doubling down on our rightness. The more that we're afflicted and the more that we feel outside external affliction is the opposite direction. And I think Pharaoh's there to teach us, no. When you are being afflicted by a plague, your instinct is to really think that you're right, and you have to take actual intentional action to take the opposite 180 and be open and curious. And that's what I think Pharaoh's here to teach us.
How do you do that? How do you do it? How do you say, I try teaching young men who are getting married. I try to teach them this sentence. I say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to your wife, your wife to be, and I want you to say these words. I want you to practice right now. You might be right. Because we guys, it's a male thing. I got to tell you, I'm sure women are also get stuck and stubborn, but I got to speak for the male gender here. We, the male community, we are taught from being little boys, we have to win. We have to win. And if you lose, it's somehow a diminishment of self. And so we get stuck in arguments and we don't turn around. You might be right. It's so counterintuitive for guys to say. And I say, it's an amazing thing because, you learn how to do this. I say to young men, if you learn how to lose a fight in your marriage, you'll have a long, happy marriage together. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it works.
I think it's very true, Eddie. I think part of it is saying, I'm curious how you got there. I always say, I'm curious. Sounds like if I was in a different place, what would I hear differently? Right? I always use that very sort of psychobabble phrasing only because it works. When you say, I'm curious how you got there, people are like, I'll tell you how I got there. And sometimes, and I do the best I can in my own life. And when I counsel people, to say things like, at the very source, we may not be right. Like, I really don't know that I'm right. So the more affirmed you are of your rightness, the more you have to know the other argument inside and out, as much as you could teach it. So the further you are in your rightness, the more you truly have to understand the other side. And
when I did a lot of debates and when I teach philosophy classes, my favorite way of coping with philosophical positions that I encourage my students to take is I will ask them in this way. I'll say, what would it take to convince you that your thesis is incorrect? What would it take? I'm not saying you are incorrect. I'm not saying you believe you're incorrect. I'm saying, what would it take? Is there any argument? Is there any set of circumstances? Is there any chain of thought that, if true, would refute your thesis? And if they say, no, there's nothing that can do that, then I say to them, well, then the problem is that what you're offering is not a philosophical thesis. It's not a belief of anything. It's an assertion. A belief that's what makes something a belief, and not a syllogism, which is completely and absolutely true by nature of its terms. In the case of a thesis, of our position about life and its principles, the only thing that belief can offer is trust that what you believe is true. But it can't be certainty that what you believe is true. And so you must be always open to what it would take to refute you. My first teacher was Richard Rubinstein, who was open to the possibility that the Holocaust refuted his Jewish faith, and he became an atheist in his massive book after Auschwitz. And for him, that was what did it. I didn't believe that Auschwitz refutes faith, and so we kind of went our own ways. But there must be an understanding through everything you believe, that there is something that could refute what you believe. I've had several changes in my life when everything I thought was true in major issues turned out not to be true. And I think I'd like to think I had the courage to say, yep, I was wrong. I was wrong because there were arguments that I didn't see that refuted everything I said and everything I believed. So understanding how people come to an argument is interesting in a psychological way, but in a philosophical way, the question is, are you open to an argument that can refute you? If you're not open to something that can refute you, you're not open to God.
Marc, what I would just add to that is I have a friend who every time we discuss an idea, he's like, now call two people that completely refute it to see if you're right. And I've learned from that always to keep in my board of directors, my personal board of directors, two people that would always refute me and my ideas, because it keeps you kosher and keeps you honest.
Yep.
So once again, we've talked about God and we've talked about Pharaoh. So it comes down to me to talk about Moses for a moment and the people of Israel. This is the Torah portion that introduces Passover, the holiday, the commemoration, the celebration. This is the Torah portion in which the people of Israel are commanded to take a lamb, to slaughter it, to put the blood on the lintel, and to sit down and have a feast. And this is the Torah portion that describes what is the really central moment of the Passover Seder, a reenactment of that last night in Egypt. And I want just for a moment to try to capture the drama of that. And it just seems to me that in some strange and ironic way, with COVID rampaging outside, and we here in Los Angeles have a deep feeling of this right now because we're one of the hot spots in the country, you know, that we're inside and and death is outside. We're sheltered inside, hoping that the plague outside doesn't find its way under the door or through the cracks of the window inside. And the idea that a family sits and has a meal, and outside they can hear the screams and the cries of Egypt in its last throes, and that our bags are packed and we're hoping to leave tonight or tomorrow to experience liberation, and that our children sit in front of us and they ask us, what is going on? Manishtana halayla hazeh. What does this night teach us? What does this night, what significance does this night carry? And we say to these children, you were born in slavery, your parents were born in slavery, your grandparents were born in slavery, but the promise is that your children will be born in freedom. And that, and the incredible promise of that moment, at the same time with the incredible danger of that moment, the sense of, are we really protected? I mean, in some ways, by the way, just the image of this is really strange and somewhat mythological. God, I mean, the joke we used to make at our Seder table is, if Santa Claus can find the houses of all the good Christian children, why does God need blood on the lintel in order to know whose house to strike down and whose house not to strike down? And the idea is that that's it. A little bit of blood, a little red on the lintel, somehow protects you from universal death, from universal destruction. And to feel that drama, that it's just that tiny layer of pigment between me and catastrophe. And at the same time, in a few hours, we'll be free. And what that's like, the the pent up emotions of that moment are so powerful. And that's really what drives the end of this Torah portion. That's what drives this Torah portion, because you sit there with the family. I just want to sit with every family, or with any family, in the slave quarters of Egypt that night and feel that. I mean, how do you eat? I mean, what do you eat? How do you feel it? How do you feel the exhilaration and the utter terror of being a slave today and a free person tomorrow, of being alive and there's death outside? This is a night of separations, of death and life, of freedom and slavery, of yesterday and tomorrow. And it's such a fraught moment. It's such a powerful and fraught moment. And you hear Moses saying to the people, have faith, we'll get through this. Because one of the traditions is that 4 out of 5 didn't leave. They weren't able to leave. They weren't able to separate themselves from the way of life of slavery. And you can understand that given what's going on about them. And then, of course, there's the great chance. I put blood on my lintel. What if the angel doesn't come in the night? And then here I've identified myself as one of them, and identified myself and put myself out there as one of them. And then what happens then? It's such a remarkable, I mean, for a moment, just gather in the drama. Just gather in the drama of of a family sitting there. Gather in the drama of Moses sitting there. Does Moses really believe that the day after that Pharaoh's going to let go after 10 times of saying not? And then ultimately, Pharaoh lets go. And the last words of Pharaoh to Moses, when he says, get out of my land, I don't want to see you again. And the last words are, bless me too. That's his capitulation. Bless me too. And for just a glimmer of a moment, underneath the masks and underneath the robes and underneath the horror and underneath the stubbornness and underneath the cruelty, you even get a glimpse that even he might be a human being in need of love. Just for a glimpse, just for a moment. And that's how the Torah portion ends tonight.
Yashar Koach, that was really beautiful.
Yasha
That's really beautiful. I think that the blood on the lintel isn't obviously for God. You set it up beautifully, that it can't be for God. So it leaves it only one possibility, and that's it's for the people. And when you look at it, it's the only act in the Exodus so far that the people actually take. Every other part of the Exodus, they're being pushed around. They're completely passive to what's happening in the Exodus. And this is the only time where they take an action. They put the blood on their doorpost and they say, I am a part of this. I'm a part of this story. But what I wanted to ask you is, how do you teach people, how do you tell people in Encino, how do you tell them they left Egypt? Because of all of the commandments that come out of the Exodus, that one to me is the most powerful, the most impossible, because I didn't leave Egypt, you didn't leave Egypt. And yet that is what we are precisely commanded to teach our children. And I'm interested in your understanding, not in how you teach the story is from the Haggadah. I'm asking, how do you teach them that they were there? Do you try to do that? And if you do, What are you really talking about? That they were really there? What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Have you lost your mind? They
No.
weren't there. They were always in Encino.
Right.
So what do you say?
Gellman, you ever been in a play?
Yes.
You ever been you ever been in a play? I can't imagine what medieval Denmark is like, but I know what Hamlet felt like for a few minutes because I was in Hamlet. I don't know what medieval Verona was like, but I could tell you what Romeo was feeling standing underneath that balcony. When you're in a play, the word play is a beautiful word because play means I enter into another experience and I really enter into that experience. And a few moments I can walk the world as Romeo or as Hamlet. For a few moments I can walk the world as a character that I'm not. And I can feel what it's like to wear that person's skin and to wear that person's face and to feel that person's emotions. I have a friend who's a very big time Hollywood acting teacher. And I asked him, how do you teach people how to act? He says, you don't. There's no such thing as acting. You have to know the emotions of the character. You have to be able to reach inside of yourself and know what that feels like, what sorrow feels like, what disappointment feels like, what rage feels like, what passion feels like. And you draw from that. You draw from that. So you're right. Living in beautiful 86-degree California, I don't have any idea what it's like to be a slave to Pharaoh in Egypt thousands of years ago. But for a moment, I can enter into the role as if I were in a play and I can feel it. And you know something? I can feel it. I can feel a little bit of it. Listen, what does the tradition tell me to do? It tells me to taste the maror. It doesn't want me to take a mouthful of maror. It tells me to taste the maror. And the maror is sweetened by the charosek. It shouldn't be too bitter, but it wants me to taste oppression, to taste horror. Listen, I have an uncle who is a survivor of the Holocaust and told us about his experiences. Part of my Pesach is always to share Uncle Henry's story. He never wanted us to really feel what he felt, but he wanted us to taste it. Because if we could taste a little bit of the hunger, the cold, the despair, the anxiety, the fear, we would spend the rest of our lives fighting against the tyranny that tried to crush his soul and steal his life. And that's what the tradition's trying to make us do. Sherry,
Well,
go ahead.
yeah.
Sherry, go ahead. Sherry.
Oh, I was just listening. I was
Oh,
like,
go ahead.
so
I'm sorry.
I was just, I mean, I was just so taken with that because I love this concept of if you taste it, you can experience just a sampling, and that would be propel you enough to take action.
And then on the other side, to taste for a moment the song, that's next week's Parsha, the exhilaration, the absolute sheer astonishment of turning around from the sea and looking out at the wilderness and taking your first breath as a free person, having spent a lifetime as a slave, is an astonishment that the Torah has in store for us. So I'm going to ask all of you to come back next week as we share that astonishment. My big thanks to Rabbi Gellman, Rabbi Hirsch, and to all of you for joining us this morning. Shabbat Shalom. Following our Torah study, of course, Shabbos service live from Valley Beth Shalom. Wonderful bat mitzvah of Natalie Subaro. And this week again, Rabbi Hillel Silverman's taking a little bit of time, but at 6 o'clock this evening, Cantor Phil and I will be back to share with you the prayers of Havdalah. Tomorrow morning, Minyan at 8:30. Monday morning, because it's a holiday, Minyan at 8:30. The rest of the week, Minyan at 7:30 in the morning, Minyan every evening at 5 o'clock. Lunch and Learn, we're learning the book of Proverbs from the Bible on Wednesday at 12:30, and we continue our series on Jewish Life Awakens on Wednesday evening. We'll soon have information for you about Purim, wonderful celebration at VBS. So watch for that. And it's MLK Day, Martin Luther King's birthday on Monday. So I urge you to take a few moments. If you're sitting at your computer, sitting at the TV, find a tape of the I Have a Dream speech and listen to it and cry, because tears will come to your eyes. This is the very, very best of our American tradition. Thank you for being with us. A very, very good Shabbat.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.